Much for coming out here to the George Washington Presidential Library. This is, as you know, we're celebrating our 10th anniversary this year. We opened in when did we open? September 27th, 2013. The original lecturer was David McCullough. You'll notice that he's a big proponent of our speaker tonight. An endorser. I think when he was alive, he was an endorser, an extraordinary storyteller. And we started these free book talks in January of 2014, and we have one every month since then. And we've had them because of the great generosity of the Ford Motor Company. Ford, as you know, has a relationship with Mount Vernon that is 100 years old. Goes back to Henry Ford when he visited Mount Vernon, and he thought that the house was under threat of fire. And he provided for the Mount Vernon Ladies Association the first fire engine that we've had. And since then, we've had Ford fire engines at Mount Vernon for 100 years. It's really quite an extraordinary relationship, a philanthropic partnership that's probably one of the oldest in the country between a corporation and a private institution. So we thank Ford tonight. Now, Stephen has given me a list of things to remind you about. And he's shaking his head, yes, I have to read these off. So get ready. Get your diaries out. First off, we have a few more seats, very few seats left for our wonderful annual Mount Vernon Symposium. This is our wonderful, we do a sequence of them. They're garden symposiums, and then they're decorative art symposiums, and they're art and architecture. This year's art and architecture, May 31st to June 2nd. The ticket comes with a great program, but all kinds of cocktails and dinners and fabulous speakers. It's called On the Eve of Independence, Art and Architecture in the British Empire. We also have a program called Lunch at the Library with Lori Ann LaRocca and her daughter Abby, and they have a new book together, Embracing Your Past and Empowering Your Future. We have our annual Martha Washington Lecture on June 20th. This is not to be missed. The wonderful new book with Anita McBride, Nancy Smith, and Diana Carlin, Remember the First Ladies, the Legacies of America's History-Making Women. That's going to be a wonderful program that evening. And our next Ford Evening Book Talk, which is what this is, June 4th, Ashley White, an old friend of mine, her new book, Revolutionary Things, Material Culture and Politics in the Late 18th Century Atlantic World. We're a one-stop shop. We have it all. There's something for everybody. I'm serious, absolutely. Okay, it's going to be a tough crowd tonight, Talmage. So Talmage Boston is our illustrious speaker tonight. He's an historian. He's an author. He's a speaker. He's an onstage interviewer, so he's going to be on the other side of the table today. He's used to asking the questions. Today he will be responsible for the answers. His work has been endorsed by David McCullough, as I mentioned, Doris Kearns Goodwin, John Meacham, Douglas Brinkley, Douglas Bradburn is endorsing him right now. You've heard my joke about Douglas Brinkley, which is so annoying for me because if you Google historian Douglas B.R., you got to get all the way to A before I show up. Unbelievable, overrated Douglas Brinkley. Annette Gordon-Reed, Evan Thomas, who may or may not be in the audience tonight. H.W. Brantz, who you all saw last month, was with us. So he's the author of numerous books, Cross-Examining History, Raising the Bar, Baseball and the Baby Boomer, and 1939, Baseball's Tipping Point. He's a leading Texas attorney, having been chosen for 3 major statewide awards in the last 5 years by the Texas Bar Foundation and the State Bar of Texas Litigation Section. He's been named Texas Super Lawyer by Thomson Reuters every year since 2003. That sounds like a pay-to-play sort of thing, Talmage.
I didn't pay.
He's the only lawyer to receive a presidential citation from 8 different presidents of the State Bar of Texas for outstanding service to the State Bar. In November of 2023, Boston was recognized by the Dallas Historical Society as the History Maker of the Year in the field of promoting history in North Texas. He's so loved in Dallas that he's going to change his name from Talmage Boston to Talmage Dallas. He joins us tonight to discuss his new book, How the Best Did It, Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents. Let's hear a big round of applause for Talmage Boston. Now, this would be worth the price of admission if we only gave you Talmage Boston. I know it's a free event. So it'd be worth it with just Talmage Boston. But I've got a double decker for you tonight. I've got a special interview for you tonight. Tonight, we'll be interviewing Talmage is Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, who is a historian of the presidency. You all know her book, The Cabinet. She produces history that speaks to fellow scholars as well as a larger public audience, which, as we all know, is very hard to do. And she knows that history can be exhilarating, and she's one of the stars in the field. Author of The Cabinet, George Washington, the Creation of the American Institution, appears frequently on Listening to America podcast. She's the creator of the Audible course, The Best and Worst Presidential Cabinets in U.S. History, which is good. Her next book, which is coming out this fall, mark your calendars, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic, will be published September 5th, 2024. She's a senior fellow at the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University. And I have the great honor to tell you tonight that she is also going to be the next executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library, starting this July. Our good friend, Dr. Patrick Sparrow, who is our current executive director, is off to take on the challenge of becoming the president of the American Philosophical Society. So very philosophical. He's back here in the back. Let's give him a big round of applause as well. Patrick, thank you for your leadership. But let's get to the main event. Come on down, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. Take your position, Talmage. Be prepared.
Or you want me on this side?
Because
All right.
Mike.
Whatever you say. You're the boss. All right. Yeah, it's fine.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. It is a delight to be able to attend this event, to be able to talk with Talmage, and to unofficially start my tenure a little bit early, because this is such a great event. I couldn't miss it. Why don't we start with the presidency is generally considered to be the hardest job in the world. I think it's an impossible job. And sometimes I think when we look at these positions, they feel really distant from our own lived experience. They feel inaccessible. The people feel inaccessible. But I think what your book does so well is it really pushes back on that notion. And I'm wondering if we could start with what can we learn from these people who tackled tasks that most of us can't even really begin to think of, and how we can apply that to our daily lives.
Well, thank you, Lindsay, and congratulations on your new position. I think the key is that they tackle these incredible challenges as President of the United States on the basis of the fact that they were mere flawed human beings, but they also had some fantastic leadership traits that any leader potentially is capable of having. And so that's the premise of my book. The audience, the target audience, is anybody who is or aspires to be a leader, or if you're already a leader, to be a better leader. How do you do that? By working into your repertoire certain leadership traits that, given the attention given to presidential history, is so well documented and so understandable. And so I think it's easy, actually, for the reader to put himself in the president's position and see what was going on and how the president responded, and then say, I could do that in my organization. For example, if you're in an organization and there's two divisions, there's warring factions within your organization, well, what are you going to do to unify? What are you going to do to build some consensus? If you're in an organization where the spirit, for whatever reason, bad economy, stock market, whatever it may be, is going down, what can I do to inspire optimism? If a adversary, a competitor, anybody along those lines is doing something to block your plan, how are you going to respond? Are you going to respond with a patient approach, well considered, that will get you the result? Or do you need to play hardball immediately to deal with the situation? When it comes time to speak to your organization, are you going to speak with vigor and snap, crackle, pop delivery, or are you going to speak calmly in a conversational style? So these are the kinds of questions that people who are aspiring to be better leaders need to be thinking about. And we can see how the president's made decisions as to how to use these traits in order to achieve fantastic results for our benefit, for history's benefit, and hopefully people can incorporate it for their organization's benefit.
So one of the ways that I've heard you describe this process, and the way that John Avalon also describes this process, is applied history. And what I love about that concept is that a lot of times we'll study history, we'll learn from history, but then often the questions that get us to the next level are not always present. So what is it that you were hoping to achieve with this applied history concept, and why is it so important right now?
Well, obviously, there's a lot of leadership books that don't even deal with history. They come up with psychology and all different kinds of angles on leadership. But to me, the best way to think about improving my leadership is based on the real world and real people doing real things, and with reliable information. And so, as I said, my target audience is anybody who is or aspires to be a better leader. You don't necessarily have to love history if you want to be a better leader and want to think of some tools that will help you be a better leader. So at the end of every one of my chapters, in every chapter, there's an average of 3 leadership traits per president that caused him to be successful. And at the end of the chapter, one thing I have is there's a little paragraph or 2 or 3, depending on the president, on their flaws. My friend Mark Updegrove, former head of the LBJ Library, now the head of the LBJ Foundation, said, you can't put these people on pedestals. They're people for people to be able to relate to them. They've got to know their flaws. So I have the section on flaws, but in the last part of each chapter is I have a series of questions for the reader to ask him or herself. How am I doing in building consensus, inspiring optimism, knowing when to speak with vigor, when to speak calmly? I want the reader to engage on an interactive basis. So you're not just sitting down and reading a book. You're actually in a position to drill down a little deeper on how you fit into these traits, or whether you're doing what you can to implement these traits. So that was the approach as to how to apply history. My friend John Avalon, who until 3 months ago was the lead political analyst for CNN, his wife is Margaret Hoover, as in Margaret Hoover's firing line. But anyway, John 3 months ago decided he's running for Congress in New York, but he's also a great presidential historian. And both of his books have been especially impactful to me because they're about applied history. The first one was about George Washington and his farewell address. The second one, which was one that I worked with him on and did programs in Dallas on, is called Lincoln and the Fight for Peace. What Lincoln was doing to try to reconcile and bring the country back together and reunite the United States, and how that, if we start thinking about that, how we might think about reuniting the United States today in its polarized condition. And he was the one who really introduced me to this phrase, applied history. I've since seen it used by a number of other people. But I thought, that's, we have this shortage of young people today who are hungry to learn history. Ken Burns says one of the main reasons is because nobody can remember their high school teacher's last name, but everybody remembers the first name, and it was Coach. And we have, too many wonderful athletic coaches who, to fill out their schedules, are assigned teaching history. And so we don't have that many super dynamic history teachers at the high school level. Obviously, we do at the college and the graduate level, but by then, people have gone in different directions. Anyway, to get young people to think about, no, this stuff really is important. This stuff really could help me. It could help me be a better business person, or a better, technological innovator, or whatever your particular career goals are, and bring that relevance that people of my generation and before always thought, well, of course we're going to study history. You got to know your history. Another wonderful Ken Burns, he loves to quote Mark Twain for the proposition that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And so hopefully,
well, that's good to know. I've stolen that line, and I never remember who I'm stealing it from. So thank you for.
And it's a great line, particularly somebody
line.
Who's in your line of work, who's going to be leading this and teaching history and doing all the good things you're going to be doing. But hopefully, when people are reading about these past presidents, I can see that situation. I can see myself in that situation. And here's how he handled it. It worked pretty well. Maybe that's what I need to be thinking about.
So you picked 8. We had the pleasure of having a conversation ahead of time, and so I know there was a lot of thought that went behind how you decided on those 8 and what were some of the important factors. So before we talk about them as individuals, maybe we could start by how did you put together this roster?
Well, first, knee jerk, these were my thoughts on the 8 greatest presidents, but I don't stand for much in the wonderful world of American history. So it was nice that my choice, for the most part, aligned with the results of the C-SPAN presidential ranking poll. Every time we have a president leave the White House and a new one come in, C-SPAN does a poll of the country's 150 leading historians and asks them to rank the presidents from best to worst on the basis of 10 presidential leadership traits. So the last 2 times they've done the poll, 2017 when Obama went out and Trump came in, 2021 when Trump went out and Biden came in, the results of the top 9 were identical. Number 1, Lincoln, 2, Washington, 3, FDR, 4, Theodore Roosevelt, 5, Eisenhower, 6, Truman, 7, Jefferson, 8, Kennedy, 9, Reagan. Well, the only adjustment that I made to these conclusions by our country's most esteemed historians, I think Truman's overrated. Truman got us into Korea and he couldn't get us out. Truman had no idea what to do with McCarthyism. Truman gets a lot of credit for dropping the A-bombs and bringing the prompt into World War II. My friend Evan Thomas over here, he and his wife Osi, wonderful new book, Road to Surrender. There's no way they weren't going to drop the bombs. They spent too much time, too much money, and Plan B was for the American forces to invade Japan and lose hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives, and for the war to be prolonged for that much longer. There's no way. So I think the best thing that ever happened to Harry Truman was David McCullough wrote a wonderful biography of him that won the Pulitzer, and so everybody fell in love with Harry Truman. I think Reagan's underrated, so I just moved him up 1 notch. But other factors, I think in 2024, more people are interested in reading about Reagan than they are Truman. I also, candidly, would love to sell my books to both Democrats and Republicans. So I was seeking for a healthy balance in the modern era. So in the modern era, I have 2 great Democratic presidents in FDR and JFK and 2 great Republican presidents in Eisenhower and Reagan. And then last but not least, in this highly polarized world that we've been living in for too long with no end in sight, I want Democrats to read this book and say, you know, we've had some great Republican presidents. And I want Republicans to read this book and say, we've had some great Democratic presidents. Let's bring down the division. Let's recognize excellence regardless of which party you're in. And so those were the reasons how I arrived at my 8.
Excellent. Well, both because of our location and our host tonight, and also for purely chronological order purposes, let's start with, and for C-SPAN ranking purposes, of course, let's start with Washington. One of the things that struck me as I was reading your chapter on Washington was the importance of trust and Washington's understanding of trust and how it had to be cultivated and preserved and cherished.
And earned.
So I'm wondering if you could share your thoughts about the importance of trust and Washington's sense of it, trust in institutions, trust in people, and why he was so remarkable in that way.
Well, as a preliminary to answering that question, I have to say that I'm here tonight, and I wrote this book in large part because 3 years ago, I came to Mount Vernon, and I heard my wonderful friend David Stewart, who's sitting on the back row, who'd written this fabulous biography of George Washington. He was speaking here, and he's basically saying, how did George Washington do it? How did he unanimously get selected to lead the Continental Army, and then unanimously get selected to lead the Constitutional Convention, then unanimously selected to be president for his first term, and unanimously for his second term? How did he do it? And David pointed out, in large part, even though he was not a particularly good public speaker, I mean, for one thing, he had a soft, breathy voice that came from a childhood respiratory illness, so he couldn't project in the era where long before anybody ever thought about a microphone. And he also had these teeth issues, which if you've been to the museum here, and I suspect you all have, by the time he was president, he only had 1 tooth in his head. So he had to speak with these unwieldy dentures, which you have in your museum. And you think, how in the world could anybody speak with essentially a bird cage in your mouth and trying to... So anyway, he was not a great public speaker, but he was a great persuader, and he earned people's trust. Number one, I They knew about his heroic deeds. They knew he'd been the most revered in terms of pure battlefield courage and distinguished leadership of sorts in the French and Indian War as a member of the British Army. He made lots of mistakes, and I'll talk about that in the book. But overall, it's a miracle he survived. I mean, he had horses shot out from under him, his hat bullet holes, his uniform bullet holes, and he came away. And people, he's a real soldier. He's had real experience. And people also know, of course, that he led the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War to victory. 8 years it took. No one thought on the front end that we could possibly win this war, but ultimately, with the strategy he devised of avoiding big losses and wearing down the British spirit of wanting to keep on fighting, he won that. And of course, the Constitutional Convention, he's the chairman. They end up with a Constitution. People agree on it. It gets ratified. So people had this awareness. This guy's amazing. He's a military leader. He's a political leader. People have a tendency to respect and trust people who have achieved those kinds of accomplishments over the course of their career. But in terms of the in-person, if George Washington walked in this room, you'd all stop and your mouths would fall over and say, who is that guy? He's the tallest guy in the room. Depending on the source, sometimes 6'2", 6'3", either way, be like somebody 6'9" walking into this room. Ramrod straight posture, impeccable wardrobe, whether he was a soldier, whether he was a politician, perfectly tailored, piercing eye contact. The portrait artist Gilbert Stuart said, you look in the eyes of George Washington, you're looking at the fiercest warrior in the jungle. And so if George Washington, who's not that much of a talker, but he's a listener, and when he's listening, he's looking with his full-faced eye contact. You feel respected. But when the time finally came for him to speak, he had sound judgment, in large part because he was so good at listening to both sides of an argument and not weighing in until he'd heard both sides and reflected on it. And then and only then would he provide his thoughts on the best decision. And sometimes he would be humble enough to say, I don't know yet. I need more time. You got good arguments on both sides. So you, Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, and you, Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, you're giving me conflicting advice. I want you guys to submit written position papers to me. And I'm going to read them, and I'm going to reflect on them, and then I'll make a decision. Again, even if he doesn't accept your advice, at least you know he considered it. He gave it strong weight. And even the people who lost on the issues battle would ultimately come to recognize, as Thomas Jefferson often did, he made the right decision. So when you develop a reputation for making sound decisions in leadership positions, people with each great decision trust you more and more and more. So there was this physical presence, there was this sound decision making, and of course, above all, there was this integrity. This was a man who never told a lie. Whether he chopped down the tree or not, we'll never know. But he never told a lie. You could take his words to the bank, and everybody knew that. Nobody questioned anything that came out of his mouth. Earn trust, that's a great way to earn trust. Be truthful, always. And so you put all those factors together, and you get it as to why he was always unanimously chosen. Everybody knew if he didn't go to the Constitutional Convention, we weren't going to have a Constitution. If he didn't agree to be the first president of the United States, who knows what would happen. If he hadn't agreed to the second term, one of the few things that Hamilton and Jefferson could agree on, they both went to him and said, you've got to do a second term. If you don't, we're not going to make it. And so that was the stature of Washington. That's why we love his home. We love this library. We love this history, because there's so many things that we can all be thinking about our own integrity, about our own command presence, about our own process for decision making. And he was so good in all those.
We can just go home now, right, Doug? So one of the people that he listened to, and what I always found remarkable when I was studying the cabinet was, he knew Jefferson was doing all sorts of schemy things outside of the cabinet, and yet he really wanted him to stay in because he valued that perspective so much. So when Jefferson gets into the presidency, his method is quite different in some ways. And you talk about a 1, 2, 3 process in the chapter. I'm wondering if you could introduce that, because it's a very different concept, and yet I think he really did draw on his experience and how he had interacted in the cabinet and what he learned.
Well, one of the things that separates Thomas Jefferson from the pack was his long-term vision for what the country should be, and then his approach to the extent he could, attempt to fulfill that vision. So, starting point, if you're going to have a long-term vision, it always helps if you start with a base of being widely read and incredibly knowledgeable, because you have a better understanding of what your potential options are for purposes of forming what you want to be your long-term vision. Jefferson was also very good at getting input from different people and comments on his thoughts about what he wanted his long-term vision, and if he got sound criticism from James Madison or George Washington or others, he'd tweak it and he'd refine it, and then he would persevere to fulfill his goals. He didn't quit at midpoint. The thing that most interests me about Jefferson, though, and I'm very curious to read your book on John Adams, because obviously he succeeded John Adams. John Adams was a Federalist. Congress was controlled by the Federalists. And during Adams' presidency, they passed the Sedition Act, which makes it a crime punishable by incarceration for anybody to criticize President Adams or Federalist policy. People were thrown in jail for exercising their freedom of speech and freedom of the press rights. Fortunately, the Sedition Act expired at the end of Adams' presidency. So day one of Thomas Jefferson's presidency, and here's another fun fact. In his 8 years as president, he gave a grand total of 2 speeches. His 2 inaugural addresses were the only 2 speeches he gave in 8 years. But in that first inaugural address, he recognizes this division caused by the Sedition Act. And he says, look, folks, we're all Federalists. We're all Republicans, i.e. we're all Americans. We better start acting that way or this country isn't going to last. Jefferson knew, like Washington, he wasn't a good public speaker. That's why he didn't give speeches. But what he did know, though, getting back to his unique talents, he was a great networker and interpersonal charmer to get people to come around to his point of view, the best that anybody can even imagine. So over the course of his 8 years, he has these dinners 2 to 3 times a week, every week for 8 years. And at the dinners, he's got Federalists, he's got Republicans. One rule: we're not going to talk about hot button issues. We're going to talk about literature, history, music, what you do for a living, your family. We're going to drink lots of wine. We're going to eat lots of good food. We're going to become friends because we're staying away from this poison that we now have in our day and that he had coming off the Adams presidency. You got to build relationships. If you want somebody to give you the benefit of the doubt, they have to like you. And to like you, you have to have fellowship. And that's what he did, and did so well that the walls, over time, came down. You didn't solve it on the first dinner or the third dinner, but week after week, month after month, year after year, the walls came tumbling down. John Meacham, in his presidential biography, talks about all the conflict that had existed during the Adams. No, it wasn't completely resolved. But look at what happened. After Jefferson's 2 terms, his best friend Madison's 2 terms, his best friend Monroe's 2 terms, 4-year window for John Quincy Adams, with another 8 years of Andrew Jackson. So 32 out of the first 36 years of the 19th century, we basically have Thomas Jefferson and his progeny. Nobody's ever had a political record like that.
So, the next, John Adams would hate that description.
Lindsay, I'll come back and we'll have a debate about John Adams.
I look forward to it. So one of the, you emphasize Lincoln's magnanimity and
Magnanimity. It's hard to say.
It's an impossible word to say. Say it again.
Got to say it several times before it'll come right out.
Okay.
Smoothly.
Can you say it one more time for me?
Magnanimity.
That. I'm wondering, you talk at several different chapters about humility and several different presidents when they demonstrate it, But Lincoln seemed to have a unique ability almost to absorb embarrassment for the greater good.
Well, he had a unique ability to absorb criticism and people who were trying to undermine his leadership. And so the word magnanimity means you're forgiving, you take the high road, you stay above the fray, and you keep your eye on the ball. His eye on the ball. I want this country to come back together. I want to win this Civil War, and I want to abolish slavery. Those are my goals. Those are monster big goals. Now, to do that, I've got to stay focused on those goals. And to stay focused on those goals, I can't get into interpersonal warfare with my team of rivals cabinet or with my Union generals, many of whom were very haughty and rude, most notably McClellan, who thought because he was an honors graduate at West Point, of course he knew how to win the Civil War. And of course Lincoln didn't, and he had less than 1 year of formal schooling. But as the war went on, it was clear you can have all the West Point credentials you want, but if you don't want to fight, you're not going to win the Civil War. So Lincoln, the genius, goes to the Library of Congress, reads up on military history, military strategy, devises a whole new strategy for winning the Civil War, implements it, and he wins. But to be that goal-oriented and to achieve those goals, you can't get bogged in interpersonal strife. And one of the other major sources, besides his cabinet, besides his generals, was his wife. Mary was a shrew. Mary woke up every day thinking of ways to undermine him and make new enemies and do embarrassing things. It was weird. And Lincoln obviously could have spent all of his time trying to figure out Mary, but he knew that that wasn't possible. And he wanted to fulfill the responsibilities that he'd taken on as president of the United States. To do that, you got to be very forgiving. Don't take the bait. Keep your eye on the goal. And he did what he did. Now, as I mentioned, each of the 8 presidents, there's an average of 3 leadership traits. So for the book, it covers 24 leadership traits over the 8 presidents. There's no repetition of the traits. So for example, in the George Washington chapter, one of his great traits was integrity, credibility. I write all that up. I could have had that in the Lincoln chapter. But then if you've read about integrity in Washington, you're not learning anything new by learning about the importance of integrity for Lincoln. So for Lincoln, out of these 24 traits, I can make a great argument that he had all 24. And I think most historians would agree with that. And I don't think anybody else is close to having all 24. Maybe Washington's close, but Washington obviously didn't have his eloquence and his power for his words to turn into deeds like Lincoln did and like Franklin Roosevelt did and like John F. Kennedy did and like Ronald Reagan did. So anyway, Lincoln, and I know, and I have the highest regard for Washington and all the wonderful people at Mount Vernon, but Lincoln's number one for a reason.
What is his biggest weakness?
What's his weakness? Well, you could say maybe he wasn't that great a husband, maybe he wasn't that great of a father because he was wanting to keep his distance from Mary. I mean, you've read about his years as a lawyer, where for 6 months out of the year, he would ride the circuit because Springfield had 2,500 people in it. You couldn't stay busy 12 months out of the year on the legal business in Springfield. You had to be traveling the circuit, the 14 counties around Springfield. Well, most of the other lawyers who rode the circuit would go home on the weekends. Lincoln didn't. That's the level of strife in that marriage, but, to the detriment of his children. So he had that. And the flaws chapter in Lincoln is shorter. He did also, like Thomas Jefferson did and like Alexander Hamilton did, he would write these anonymous editorials where he was very critical of others, but he didn't want to use his own name. I mean, that's not forthright. That's not honest Abe-like. But that was kind of what people did. Well, he wrote a nasty editorial about somebody, and people recognized this came from Lincoln. So the guy challenges him to a duel. And in those days, you couldn't turn that down. So Lincoln chooses broadswords, not guns, and they're on their way to the duel, and they make peace, and that's the end of it. There never was a duel. Thank goodness nobody got killed. But So early on, he had some things that he needed to be honest, Dave, to be the mountaintop of integrity and everything else. He had to stop doing that behind the back criticism with anonymous editorials. But for the most part, it's hard to find flaws on Lincoln. I mean, at the beginning of the Lincoln chapter, I have a wonderful quote from Tolstoy. And Tolstoy says, hey, you can talk about the great leaders in the world, in history. Alexander the Great, you name them. None of them are at Lincoln's level. None of them. And I make the case that Lincoln uniquely was a genius in 4 areas. I mean, he was a legal genius. If you study his trial and appellate career, he was great. He was a great advocate. He was great at recognizing when he had a bad case and he'd get it settled to not pursue a vexatious lawsuit. He was a political genius. Here was a guy who had a grand total of 2 years as a member of the U.S. House, and lo and behold, he gets elected president. How do we do that? Until recently, when we had Donald Trump get elected with no political experience. But up until then, it was like, what? And the way he orchestrated the 1860 Republican Convention with the strategy, I want to go in that convention being in second place. I don't think the first place guy, Seward, is going to have what it takes. I want to be positioned to be the choice once people realize Seward can't get it. He was also, as I mentioned, he became a military genius. I mean, he came up with the plan that won the Civil War through study and talking to generals and figuring all that out. And then last but not least, he was a theological genius. And this is John Meacham's newest biography. This is Ronald White's 4 books, such that he has this faith journey during his presidency that leads to the big conclusion in the second inaugural address, the one that ends with malice toward none, with charity for all, 1 month before Appomattox and 1 month before he's killed. But he basically says, I've been on my knees, I've been praying, I've been reading the Bible and trying to figure everything out. How can a just and loving God allow this to happen in our great country? 750,000 people have lost their lives. Millions are injured. Tons of amputees. Why, God? Why? And he came up with the answer. This was God's punishment for our allowing slavery over our history until then. That is the message of the second inaugural address. Nobody else had drawn that conclusion before.
So, you talked about how a lot of these traits, a lot of the other presidents could have had, and so you were selective about making sure you weren't being repetitious and wanting to ensure that there was new information. But I don't know that we necessarily associate magnanimity with other presidents. So if you were to apply that trait to others, what other chapter would that have fit in? And if not one of the chapters, is there a president?
Well, I think George Washington had magnanimity. I think he was above the fray. I think first and foremost, he wanted to be the nation's unifier, and in the midst of conflict was staying above the fray. So, I mean, he comes to mind immediately. He may be the only one. It's a pretty rare trait when you think about it. It's a pretty rare trait.
It doesn't usually go hand in hand with the type of...
Well, and particularly with what we've been seeing in recent years, where people are always taking the bait, and people are always jumping into the fray, and it gets ugly, and it causes government dysfunction, and nobody's able to accomplish their goals in government because there's just so much interpersonal infighting.
One of the presidents who is perhaps known for constantly jumping into the fray, but we kind of love him for it anyway, is Theodore Roosevelt. And go ahead. No.
Well, Theodore Roosevelt, if we had a knee-jerk reaction, I say the word Theodore Roosevelt, I think a lot of people in the room would say bully pulpit. And Theodore Roosevelt used the presidency as his bully pulpit. He was not a particularly great orator, unlike Lincoln and Roosevelt and Kennedy and Reagan, who understood that the real power in rhetoric and oratory, and David McCullough was famous for this, was your words have got to have rhythm so that people can process them, so that the words can resonate and reverberate and penetrate. And Theodore Roosevelt talked like a machine gun. High speed, high energy, teeth. Look at the old newsreels, And so for the most part, his rhetoric was not particularly memorable. I mean, there are notable exceptions, the man in the arena, but that was after he was president. But Roosevelt, why he's rated number 4, even though there wasn't a war going on, there wasn't a Great Depression going on, but he's ranked number 4 because he expanded the presidency in good directions. Before Theodore Roosevelt came along, everybody felt like I just need to do what my predecessor did. Nobody was thinking of ways that a president could make such a positive difference in the country. And Roosevelt could see it. And he was very ambitious. I mean, one of his flaws, he didn't have a real high regard for the balance of power. He really wanted the president to make all these decisions, particularly because Congress wasn't working very well. And so he does things like get involved in a labor dispute, which no president for the great national coal strike of 1902, and had he not gotten involved and gotten it resolved, half the country would have frozen to death in the winter. We got this beautiful country out here. Shouldn't we have national parks to preserve it? Shouldn't we have wildlife refuges to protect these birds and animals that maybe need to be protected? Shouldn't we do what it takes to have a Panama Canal so that we don't have to go all the way around South America to get to the other side of the world? Shouldn't we be busting these trusts that are causing the rich to be fabulously rich and everybody else to be way on down? So he's looking for ways that America needed to be better, and he was proactive and accomplished. And so that's, getting back to leadership. If you're a leader, are you kind of stuck in doing what your predecessor did? Or are you thinking of new and different and important ways that you can lead your organization in new directions and accomplish them for the good of the organization? That's the story of Theodore Roosevelt's presidency.
It strikes me that, one of the things that's really hard for humans to do is visualize something they haven't seen before. We don't have a whole lot of, we're not always great on imagination and our limitations. And so it strikes me that one thing that he had was this really robust imagination to push beyond the confines of the office as they had previously been defined.
It's my conclusion that Theodore Roosevelt was our highest IQ president. He wrote more books than any president. He read more books than any president, and he had a photographic memory like Lincoln did, such that he memorized. They went into his memory. He could call back everything he read on command and work it into whatever he needed to work it into. So he was just off the charts brilliant and off the charts energized. His problem, for the good of America, he was president between the ages of 42 and 50 in his prime. After he left the presidency, he died at age 60 because this locomotive basically ran out of fuel and gas, and he twisted off. In the last 10 years of his life, he's basically making bad decisions. But fortunately, that was after his presidency, not during his presidency. But, the whole bullet moose and, dividing the Republican Party and the crazy trip down the Amazon where he nearly dies and he pushes his sons into World War I and front lines, and one of them gets killed and 2 get badly injured. And he even wants to lead a Rough Riders group at age 58 in World War I, and Woodrow Wilson says, I don't think so. So he's doing just nutty stuff. And I talk about that in the flaws section of the book. It makes for very interesting reading. If you've read Edmund Morris's trilogy on Theodore Roosevelt, the first one won the Pulitzer, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, up to the presidency. The second one, his presidential years, and then the third one, his post-presidency, Colonel Roosevelt. The third one, it makes for a fascinating read, but it's a sad tale of somebody who was so great, who declined and met an early death.
I think one of the craziest things that he did was after winning his own election, he said that he wasn't going to run again, and it was sort of an impetuous decision.
I mean, you use the word crazy, and I can see why you would use that. But the truth of the matter was, he thought he was following in the footsteps of the precedent set by George Washington. I mean, McKinley had been in office for a second term about 6 months when he got assassinated. So here's Roosevelt. He's got 3.5 years. That's like a first term. And then he runs for his first full term, but he's been in president for 7.5 years. And so he thought, well, no, kind of George set the standard. And of course, it wasn't until his cousin Franklin came along that anybody rethought whether that standard in fact be in place. And we all know the decision Franklin Roosevelt made. But it's always a good idea to follow the example of George Washington, and and uh, and who knows what another 4 years of Theodore Roosevelt, knowing what we know about this strange decline in his capacity to make good decisions, how that would have gone. So his 7.5 years were years of great presidential performance.
Yeah, I guess I always wonder if his some
And
of
he did
his
deeply regret.
well, that's what
He
I
said, "Man, why did I say that?"
and interestingly, his wife, the minute he said that, she's like, "Oh, that he's gonna hate that." But I wonder if some of his impetuous choices later were to make up for, he didn't have an outlet for his ambition in the way that he would have.
Yeah, I mean, he was over energized. I mean, one of my favorite anecdotes was while he was president of the United States, there was a tennis court there at the White House, and one day he played 109 games of tennis, and he wasn't a very good tennis player. But when he occasionally would make a good shot, he would just start jumping up and down, and you'd think you'd be worn out. You play 109 games of tennis. No, if he made a good shot, he just went bonkers and used up all that energy, even more energy. And if you take a tour, my wife Claire and I, not long after we married, took a tour of Oyster Bay, his home. And the one thing I remember from that tour was the woman who led it said, he started every day by drinking a gallon of coffee.
Oof.
Well, you're pretty jazzed if you start a day drinking a gallon of coffee.
No wonder his heart gave out.
He also ate 12 eggs. Man, excess.
So, one of I think the interesting parallels that you sort of touch on in the book, but I'd love for you to dig into more is Eisenhower is one of the few people who came into office with the stature that maybe resembled what Washington enjoyed.
Yeah, we skipped Franklin Roosevelt. Maybe there's a reason for that, but
Looking at
maybe
the clock.
the clock is the reason. Okay. No, Eisenhower, yeah, great military leader. Nobody knew what kind of a political leader he would be, but by being the Supreme Allied Commander, he obviously was a master organizer. He orchestrated all these countries coming together and agreeing to a overall plan and executing, which led to victory. And he'd never held political office before, but because he's such a national hero, the way George Washington had been, although George had held political office in the Continental Congresses and the Virginia House of Burgesses, Eisenhower had no political experience, but he knew how to run a meeting, and he knew how to set up an organization and make it run like a well-oiled machine, and he did. And so the first trait in my Eisenhower chapter for any of you who run large organizations or you have children who have run large organizations, it's a master class in how to run a large organization effectively and efficiently. He totally remade how cabinet operated. Meetings every single Friday, and Eisenhower's there, and he's the center of attention. He had a rule. You couldn't bring up a subject that involved just your department. He wanted people to be looking at the bigger pictures. And all these smart guys who are members of the cabinet, he wanted to engage their opinions and bring on debate. Yes, he was the ultimate final decision maker, as was George Washington, as is every president. But just the way that he orchestrated all. One of the great fun facts of presidential history is that in 1960, John F. Kennedy ran for president, and he claimed that there was a missile gap, that under Eisenhower's presidency, there had been a missile gap, and we were behind the Soviet Union. And here was Kennedy and the new frontier, and Eisenhower, 70 years old, was too darn old, even though he's more than a decade younger than the president we now have. And people thought, he's just on cruise control, and all these people are making the other decisions. And so when he leaves the White House, the first presidential ranking poll, he's ranked 22nd out of 34. He's a bottom 1/3 president. And now all of a sudden he's number 5. What happened? Well, what happened was when he left the White House, for a time period, your presidential papers are confidential and they're not made available to scholars. Once they were made available to scholars, people said, oh my God, he was in the middle of everything. He was the guy responsible for all these good decisions. And as Harry Truman once said, it takes 50 years for the dust to settle. before you can really come up with a solid, reliable conclusion about a historical figure's legacy. It took a while, but people finally realized, you know what? 8 years of peace and prosperity, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good record. The first 6 months, of course, he brought an end to the Korean War, and but after that, not an American soldier lost their life. That's a pretty amazing record, and people didn't have an appreciation for it, but they do now. There's been a lot of wonderful biographies written on Eisenhower. One by my friend Evan Thomas and his wife Osie over here, Ike's Bluff, about his foreign policy, about how he was a great poker player. He knew how to bluff, and he put those skills to use in bluffing people all over the globe in terms of threatening to do things that they back off, and he never had to use the ultimate force. He was always talking about, no, we might just use nuclear weapons. He never had any intention of doing that, particularly after the Soviets had it. But he knew how to bluff, and he knew how to strategize and get things to go his way. That's why we had 8 years of peace and prosperity.
So I've intentionally not asked about some presidents because I wanted to leave some subjects for you all to ask questions. There are some microphones on either side, so please raise your hand and wait for the microphone so everyone can hear you and people can hear you online. Looks like there's one in the back over there on the left.
Hello. Did you
Stand
mention?
up, please? Would you mind standing up?
That's too loud.
Thank you.
Yes, when you were writing about Lincoln, did you discuss his chronic, what they call melancholy at that time, or depression?
He had melancholy as a young man that ultimately made his friends so concerned that they took away razors. They were scared to death that he might commit suicide. But I talk about in the book about what really brought, for the most part, an end to that serious melancholy was his decision associated with, and that melancholy in large part was brought on by the fact that he had proposed to Mary Todd. She had accepted his proposal, and then he reneged and said, no, I've got to break off this engagement, which obviously upset Mary Todd. But it had more of an impact on Lincoln because he thought, I've done something that's truly dishonorable. I have not fulfilled the promise I made when I made the proposal. And that's the last leadership trait on Lincoln that I talk about in the chapter, is that from then on, he was in the business. When he made a promise, he kept the promise. I have no reason to think it was biochemical. I think it was all of these presidents are very concerned about their place in history, their legacy, and therefore they were relentless self-critics. And so I think he was down on himself because he was so disappointed that he had broken a promise. And so through a series of thoughts, conversations, and encounters with friends, he rethinks his whole decision, and he goes back to Mary Todd and reconciles, and of course they get married. And in fairness to Mary Todd, I know I said bad things about her earlier, but Mary Todd was brilliant, and she was ambitious, and she was a big part of his rise, and she was obviously great at identifying talent. She barely started dating Abraham Lincoln, and she said, I think this guy can be president. Of course, she wanted to be married to the president. That was her ambition. Nobody thought a woman could be president in the 19th century. But that was the dramatic turnaround, such that obviously when you're president of the United States, there's a civil war going on and so many people are getting killed and wounded and all this stuff, you have to be depressed to a certain extent. And yet, Lincoln could always tell stories, tell jokes, make people engaged, and project an unflappability such that no matter how bad the war got the first 2 years, he had what it took to keep pointing onward toward victory. And of course, he succeeded. So I think that melancholy aspect was something that was particularly troubling in his earlier years as an adult, that you don't hear about the melancholy thereafter, and particularly during his presidency.
Everyone from the side of the room? Always like to keep balance.
Here's one.
Was there a time when you looked at the weaknesses where one of these 8 presidents was in trouble because the challenge they were facing was like the last thing they wanted to see based on the weaknesses that you uncovered? And so how did they get past that?
These 8 were largely men of incredible self-confidence. And so even though they were self-aware, they knew their strengths, they knew their weaknesses, I don't think I guess we could think of 2 examples going back to Lindsay's question. Both Washington and Eisenhower, as children and growing up, had hot tempers and would explode. And they were both smart enough to know this isn't the way great leaders are supposed to behave. I've got to get control of this temper. And for the most part, they did. During Washington's presidency, Doug may or Lindsay may know, there may be a couple of instances where in private they lost it, but for the most part, he had conquered that lack of self-control and temper. And Eisenhower did as well. And so I guess those come to mind as strong weaknesses that both of those great men had the wherewithal to overcome, and that obviously impacted their effectiveness as presidents.
One back over here.
Hello, Mr. Boston. Being from Texas, I'm curious if where you think LBJ ranks. I mean, he inherited the Vietnam War from Kennedy. That was his downfall. He was only a one-term president, but I don't think there was any other president got more legislation and stuff done than he did. And I didn't discover that until I went to Texas and I went to his library. I went to his home, the Texas White House, saw his old plane that flew in there and stuff. So
Right.
I learned a lot, but I just like you said for
Okay. Here's my answer on LBJ.
Yeah.
And again, it's tied to the C-SPAN presidential ranking poll that I suspect you'll like these results. That in the 2017 poll, Reagan 9th, LBJ 10th. In the 2021 poll, Reagan 9th, Obama 10th, LBJ 11th. So I think per Harry Truman's formula, it's going to take a while for the dust to settle. I don't think Obama's going to stay a top 10 president, but be that as it may, to your question, LBJ, you say he inherited the Vietnam War. I think there's a lot of people who would disagree with that. Yes, Kennedy put 16,000, quote, advisors into Vietnam, but in terms of the esteemed scholars who have written books and books and books, would Kennedy have escalated the war the way that LBJ did? That was the issue. The 16,000 advisors didn't create the national divide. The massive escalation is what created the national divide. Now, I personally think that if I'm the President of the United States in 1964 and 5 and 6 and 7, there were no clear answers on Vietnam. It was a indiscernible mess in terms of what's the best thing that the United States should do to deal with communism, but not to enter into a war that we could never win. And so I give LBJ a level of forgiveness on making the decision to escalate, and the scholars are split as to whether Kennedy would have escalated had he not been assassinated. Mark Updegrove says it is a fool's errand to say one way or the other. There is good evidence on both sides as to whether Kennedy would have escalated Vietnam the way LBJ did. But the big problem with LBJ, in my opinion, is that he consistently lied to the American people about what was going on in Vietnam. And for that reason, he is not in my top 8. Yes.
You'd mentioned at the beginning of the talk that you thought that Ronald Reagan was underrated. Can you explain your earlier comment?
Sure. H.W. Brands, who was here recently, who wrote a wonderful biography of Reagan, said that what FDR was to the first half of the 20th century, Reagan was to the second half. And Richard Reeves, who wrote a wonderful biography of Reagan, said what FDR was to liberals, Reagan was to conservatives. But keep in mind, you're old enough to remember, and almost everybody in this audience is old enough to remember, Reagan became the president after the disastrous presidency of Jimmy Carter, where double-digit inflation, high unemployment, low economic growth, long gas lines, and we couldn't rescue the hostages from Iran. We were in a state of national malaise. We needed somebody to remind us of American exceptionalism and to do what it took to restore the nation's self-confidence. And lo and behold, not only do that, but bring an end to the Cold War, for heaven's sakes. And so one of the fun things about the research on Reagan, I didn't fully understand so much of his power came from this incredible spirit of optimism that not only he had, but that he spread to whoever was around him. In fact, I'm now going to tell you the story that was the one instance during my research for the book when I fell out of my chair with a belly laugh. I was laughing so hard. And it was a story about optimism that Ronald Reagan told almost constantly. And one of my good friends was the assistant press secretary in the White House. I said, oh yeah, I heard that story a lot. So here's the story. Once upon a time, there was a family that had twin 10-year-old boys. And one of them was a hopeless pessimist. The glass was always half empty. And the other was this wild-eyed optimist, the glass half full. And they had such extreme attitudes that the parents thought they're out of whack. Something needs to adjust both of them. And so they took him to a psychiatrist. And so the psychiatrist talked to both the boys, and then he came up with an experiment. And so he had a room over here for the pessimist that was filled with bright, shiny toys. He said, okay, you're going to be in here for a couple of hours. Enjoy the toys. It's like Christmas. You go, oh, that's where he left the pessimist. The other one was totally filled with horse manure. That's where he left the optimist. Said, okay, I'll be back in a couple of hours and do what you want. So at the end of the 2 hours, he goes in the room with the pessimist. And lo and behold, the boy's crying. He said, what? You got all these toys. What's the deal here? He goes, I'm scared to death. I'm going to break these toys. And so then he goes in the room with the optimist. The kid's singing, he's laughing, he's found a shovel, he's shoveling, he's going, what's going on here? Why are you so happy about this? He said, oh man, with all this manure here, there's got to be a pony somewhere. That was Ronald Reagan. There's a pony here somewhere. And I always believe it. And if you read about his father was a horrible alcoholic. They moved from town to town, home to home, living out of suitcases. There was no reason for him to become an optimist based on his upbringing. His mother was a saint. His mother developed him, and he always, by high school, he's playing football. He's president of the student council. I mean, he's playing in dramatic productions that, of course, led to his acting career. But just reading about Reagan's optimism, but then getting back to the Thomas Jefferson, the long-term vision to win the Cold War and to take advantage of the declining Soviet economy, to take advantage of them finally having a leader, Gorbachev, who was willing to negotiate and be sensible and ultimately produce those wonderful results. And in the last year of Reagan's presidency, he was over there for the summit in Moscow with Gorbachev, and he got to speak at Moscow State University. And he was already seeing that all this old bad stuff and anti-democratic stuff was going to fall by the wayside, and that all of a sudden there were reasons for Russian youth to be optimistic about their future because they get to take advantage of some of the things, at least, that makes Americans typically so optimistic and glad to live here. And I encourage you to find that speech and read that speech and be uplifted by that speech. A president we haven't talked about tonight, John F. Kennedy. I encourage you to read his first inaugural address. Read his speech at Rice Stadium where he said, we're going to have a man on the moon in this decade. Not because it's easy, but because it's hard. It's going to show how smart and strong we are, and we're going to get there. Read his speech on national TV about civil rights, where he said, this issue of civil rights, it's no longer a political issue. It's a moral issue for all of us. And then read his Ich bin ein Berliner speech, where here these West Berlins, they're surrounded by the wall, and they don't know if they're going to make it. And he gets up there and he says, the world is behind you. America's behind you. I'm behind you. Ich bin ein Berliner. I'm a Berliner. And it's just so elevating. It's so uplifting. And this is the modern era. People of our lifetimes have been able to move the needle with such force. And the biographer of Kennedy, Stephen Knott, who I saw, you say, how do you do it? What would the magic that would cause his words to become deeds? And Stephen Knott's conclusion was, he always appealed to the better angels of our nature. The famous words from Lincoln's first inaugural. He did not make his speeches with an effort to persuade on the basis of our dark sides. It was always on our better angels. And that's what moves the needle and makes the country want to move forward under the leader's direction and thoughts.
I think that's a pretty good place to end for the end of the evening. So everyone, if you could join me in giving a round of applause. There are books available for sale outside. I highly encourage you all to pick it up. One of the things I think is most interesting is actually the appendix at the end with the leadership traits. So highly recommend.
Should I go out there and sit at the table? Oh, sit here.